So what I'm going to do with this session is go a little bit deeper into a framework that we talk about in our what we call our faith and work track. We have kind of a leadership training program at our church, and we have a track focused on faith and work. And this framework is one of the more helpful ones that people find, so I thought I'd share it with you. Justin said the big green button. Here we go. Okay, it worked. So, faith and work exilic framework. This we call the exilic framework, thinking about what does it mean to be in exile. And this is, several people have written, there's some recent books on the idea of being in exile. So I find this a really helpful framework for faith in general, but it's particularly helpful when thinking about the workplace. So I think I was going to introduce my family, but I already did that. So I'm going to start just by talking about this organization we're starting, though. It's called the Bay Area Center for Faith, Work, and Tech. Our mission is to cultivate faith and work integration in the Bay Area to transform people who are transforming the world. And we really have this sense that I think a lot of you have here in this part of the world as well, where so many of the decisions and products and trends that are being created end up affecting the entire world. And so this desire to create this organization has really sprung from years of being a pastor in this place and years of talking to people who have this sense that they're living in a really important part of the world in a really important time, and they know Christ, but they just don't totally know how to connect the dots. And it seems like if we are followers of the one true God, then there would be some way that our faith could inform the work we do, and perhaps even that God could use it for the sake of the world. And there's been a lot of backlash against tech and against technology. And so how do we as Christians enter into that space with a uniquely Christian voice around technology? And not everybody in the Bay Area works for tech, just like not everybody here works for tech. But we're also convinced even if you don't work in technology, you work with technology. And so at least in the Bay Area, we have a guy that he's a Army sergeant, and he said the Army is a tech company. Everything is a tech company. You know, we have physicians, we have lawyers, and technology has so infused our culture that to think well about technology as Christians, I think is really critical for us. So that's part of why we've included tech in this whole picture of faith, work, and tech. So I don't know if I have the website on there. It's just faithworktech.org if you're interested in what we're doing. And we're about to release, we're about to officially launch in about a month or so. We'll have a new website and have some content and stuff like that. So it's actually an interesting group. Some of you may know there's a group here in Seattle that I'm connected with called AI and Faith. I don't know if anybody of you have heard of that, but it's a bunch of professors from SPU, I think, that have coordinated that effort. So what we're going to talk about today, I know that you're familiar with this because I've seen it even in your liturgy, is the general story of the Bible. Often people talk about this as the 4 stages. Sometimes there's a 5th, sometimes there's a 6th. Depends on how you tell it, but creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And I want to start from that, but then suggest a different kind of story of the Bible framework that is 1 step simpler. And if you're a preacher, you really like 3 steps, not 4. So it's a 3-step story of the Bible. Just makes it that much easier. And that is the exilic arc. That's what I call it. And it just means that when God created, he created a home. And then the people that he created to live in that home were exiled from it. They were not able to live within it. And at the end of the story, in the beginning of a new story, but at the end of this story, they will return home to a remodeled home, an upgraded home. Renovations will have been completed. So that's kind of the main story arc. And I want to just dive into that for a minute, kind of explain why I think that is a fair reading of the scriptures. If you assign passages to this, then roughly that first step is Genesis 1 to 3. that describes the home that we were created with or in. And then most of the rest of the Bible describes the exile. Genesis 4 through about Revelation 19. And then the return from exile picks up at the end of the story in Revelation 20 to 22. So that means that this idea of exile is really a dominant theme throughout all of Scripture. And the idea of exile just means that there is a home for you, but you are not living in it. And I think that is very resonant with a lot of people's experiences, that we know we were created for something more. We know there's some tension with our current experience, and a lot of our efforts are spent trying to resolve that tension. So let me defend this a little bit by walking through some of the scriptures. This is in the beginning, Genesis 2, God created the heavens and the earth. God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him, male and female, he created them. So this is man created as a worker in God's image. We were created not only to live in this home, but to take care of this home. This is, of course, from the early stages of the Genesis story. And then this is what I talked about a little bit this morning, the purpose of humankind, the problem being that there was no man to work the ground, the solution being that God formed the man and put him in the garden to work it and keep it. So this home experience is one in which humankind was put there with a task of caring for the home. What's interesting then is that if you get to Genesis 3:22, he drove out the man. So this is the end of the home story. And what happens in this part of the story is that God intentionally sends his people out of their home. And this is one of the most, interesting passages here. This reads, let me just pull this up on my phone so I can read the slides. All right, perfect. So this passage is really interesting to me because the idea, you might ask the question, well, why did God have to send his people into exile? Why couldn't they stay in his home? And this passage in Genesis 3, if you read it, the Lord God said, "Behold, the man has become like one of us in knowing good and evil. Now, lest he reach out his hand and take also of the tree of life and eat and live forever." And you notice that hyphen there, those dashes. The translators put that there because the sentence in Hebrew just trails off. It never finishes. The grammar is incomplete. And so that's why those dashes were put there. And what I imagine is God is saying these words. He's saying, imagine if humankind stayed there. He's saying if they reached out their hand, and it's slow motion, they reached out their hand, they took from the fruit, they ate, and they lived forever. And he can't even continue the sentence because the idea is so horrific to God. The idea that humankind would live forever in the state of sin that they are in at the end of this story. He can't even imagine it. And so what God does is he sends them out. He says, I can't even process how horrible it would be for humankind to stay in the home with the brokenness that they've brought upon themselves. And so he exiles them from that home in order for the problem to be solved over the course of history. And so what we see is that God sends his people out from their home, not even as a punishment so much, but as a protection. That God is protecting them from the horror of living in sin in the Garden of Eden. And we know that because at the end of the story, there's all of these parallels between Genesis 1 to 3 and Revelation 20 to 22. So it's very clear that the biblical authors and the divine author of the scriptures want to make this connection that when Jesus returns, what's happening is a return to what was originally intended, but even better. And that's one of the, I'm getting a little off track here, but that's one of the most beautiful things I think about the biblical story is that the redeemed creation is actually better than the pristine creation. And that's a powerful part of the biblical story. You think the garden was perfect, and yet the redeemed picture is actually an improvement. So if we keep reading in the story, this is what I was talking about. This is how we know that this is what's going on. Revelation 22, you get to that part and you read so many things in parallel. The thing I want to pull out just that is one of the most interesting things is the tree of life. If you notice that what happened in Genesis 3 is that God was protecting them from eating of the tree of life. He couldn't imagine the state where they could eat from the tree of life in the current state. When you get to Revelation 22, we haven't heard about the tree of life anywhere else in Scripture. After Genesis 3, it vanishes. It's referred to a couple times, but it's never there. Now, Revelation 22, the tree of life is back. Now, people are able to eat of it. Through the middle of the street of the city, on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month, the leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. So now, what would have been poison to people in their sinful state becomes the source of healing and life for all of eternity. So all of that to say this great picture of home, exile, and return, and to realize that we're living in this middle part of the story, that we're living with this memory, this built-in memory of something that was so good, and this hope and expectation of something that will be even better, and yet we don't experience either of those things in our current state today. Now, we have tastes of it through the gospel. We have pieces of it. That's what the church is supposed to be. It's supposed to be a foretaste of what's to come, but it's only a foretaste. We will not experience it in its perfection. We will not get all of it. What that means for our jobs then is that we live with that tension. We live in exile. So this is how I understand exile. Exile occurs when one is compelled to leave a natural environment, remember that natural environment, to operate in a foreign environment which has dissonance with the natural environment. So you used to be in one place, you had to leave, and you're operating in a different kind of place where you experience some tension with that place. And that's the experience of an exile. You don't belong. It's not your home. You don't fit in. People don't understand you. There's some kind of tension. And what we're going to be thinking a lot about as believers then is that if this story is true, that we're living in this middle stage, then we have to stop trying today to relieve the tension. We have to stop trying to solve the exile and start trusting Christ to solve it in his time. And we're going to talk about what that looks like in our work. So here's my very artistic rendition of this experience. So you have the natural environment. The exile is compelled to leave that natural environment, and they're forced into a current environment. When you get to that current environment, then you have this identity that you have carried forth from your natural environment that now exists in contrast to the current environment. And part of the tension is that difference, that distinction between who I am and how I have to operate in the culture that I live in. It's a little bit different than the experience of immigrants, because when you immigrate, you leave one natural environment to come to another environment, but it's not a compulsion, but that sense of tension is often the same. And so many of you that have moved from new places, I moved internationally. I moved from Texas to California, and that was like a very distinct contrast that I experienced. And so we're familiar with this sense of something in our past that still defines us. Now, what happens, and this is where really the meat of it is I want to talk about what we do to resolve that. This is what I call the temptations of the exile. And so if you follow along my little diagrams, the smaller, lighter blue circle is the identity, and the larger blue circle is the environment. One of the temptations is syncretism. And so in syncretism, you try to assimilate to the environment around you. Remember, we're experiencing a tension between me and my environment. And so in syncretism, I become like my environment. And when I do that, the tension is resolved because there's no more distinction between us. What happens then is I lose distinctiveness with the environment that I live in. I've lost that core identity that is me. And so each of these strategies is a way to relieve discomfort. In this way, we relieve the discomfort by changing our values. And like anything, both of these extremes are things many of us have experienced. So if we think about this with our faith, we are constantly tempted to figure out how is it that I maintain my identity as a Christian in a culture that has all sorts of values that are contrary to my Christian faith. And we're always concerned about this problem of losing my identity, of giving up, of compromising, of conforming. You know, the scriptures say, do not be conformed to the world. That's this type of temptation. And so that's on one side, is we become like the environment. The other temptation is the opposite extreme. This is escapism. And this is where you solve the problem by separating, by pulling back from your environment. And this can happen either physically, you can withdraw and live among people that are like you. It can happen emotionally, where you kind of separate yourself from the people around you. It can happen through compartmentalization, where you just keep the different parts of your lives in different compartments, and that way you don't have to experience the tension. The problem here is you lose engagement with the world. And if we believe as followers of Jesus that we are not just living in exile, but we are actually sent into exile, if God actually intends us to be in the environment that we find ourselves in, then we lose our mission. We lose the purpose for which God has put us there when we just separate from it. So in this example, we relieve the discomfort by leaving the environment. And I think if you kind of reflect on what it means to be a Christian in the world today, you'll see both those tendencies. You know, the escapism is, on the far extreme, there's let's all withdraw and let's kind of all live together and all work together and let's only hire Christian plumbers and Christian electricians and Christian doctors, and let's all, let's only interact with other people of faith, and let's not think about it, let's not be polluted by anything. And there's certainly a value. The driving force there is, how do I maintain my identity? How do I relieve that tension? Because the other extreme is to lose your identity and to just conform and give it up. But what I'm convinced of is that what it means to follow Jesus is to stay in that middle place. And it's not a very popular message, because what I'm saying is you have to live with constant discomfort. That's what I think it means to be a Christian in this world. You live with that constant tension of living in the exile. And everything in us wants to solve that problem, to relieve the discomfort. The problem is both of the solutions end up sacrificing something that's critical to faith, and we're not capable of solving it anyway, but God is. And so that's why scriptures say wait all the time. Wait on the Lord. Wait for the Lord. The exile has been solved. The solution is in process, but for now, we live in this place. And so actually, in the workplace, in the context of the workplace, you get sent into your workplace and you experience discomfort as a Christian. Sometimes overtly so. Sometimes I had a conversation about a month ago with woman in my church that works at a large tech company, and she had one of her employees file an HR complaint against her for a different kind of matter. But in the process of that HR investigation, it came out that she was hosting a Bible study in her home, and she invited some of her colleagues and employees to the Bible study. And so HR grilled her on whether she prayed at the Bible study with her employees present. And she said, aren't I allowed to do that? This is my home. So sometimes it's very overt. You get this tension. Most of the time, I think it's not that overt. It's more undercurrents. It's more how people talk. It's more the values that are espoused by many of our workplaces that are in tension. But the call then is to live with that tension, to hold it, to live in that discomfort, and to stay physically, emotionally engaged, not to just withdraw or compartmentalize, and certainly not to be conformed and to lose your value, but to embrace that tension. And what that means is it takes a lot of wisdom. There's no handbook for this. There's no guide for, do this when your coworker says this, respond that. It's the Spirit. It's the Spirit leading you in wisdom. And it's this community saying, hey, I faced this situation. How do you think I should handle it? Can you pray with me? Can you pray for me? It's trying to solve those things in the moment with the guidance of the Spirit. There's not a pattern to follow. Embracing that tension. I can tell you how to escape. I can tell you how to syncretize. Those are easy. It's the tension that's hard. And that requires the Spirit, it requires a community, it requires faithfulness. So we don't get a handbook, but we do get stories. And the Bible is full of stories of people doing exactly this. And so that's, I think, where we go next is one of the greatest stories. Let me skip over this slide just for the sake of time, but you might kind of reflect on, for you personally, what a greater temptation is. Are you more tempted towards the one or the other? And often it's both in different settings, with different crowds, different seasons of our lives. Maybe one moment it's this, or the next moment it's that, depending on a conversation, how it goes. So it's not a perfect bucketing, but I think that framework helps us. So the story I want to look at in the next 10 minutes is the story of Daniel. Daniel, basically the whole book is stories about this. How do you live in exile well? And it begins like this. This is Daniel 1, 3-5. Then the king, so just the background is that Babylon has conquered Jerusalem and is deporting people from Jerusalem back to Babylon. The king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility, young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, qualified to serve. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. The king assigned them a daily portion of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. So where I live, there's a lot of tech companies that hire young, smart, privileged people from the best universities. They move them from their homes to live close to the tech companies. They train them while they're young to take positions in their company. They give them really good free food while they're doing that. They wash their cars while they're at work. And then eventually those people take positions of responsibility within the company to further the mission of the company. Does that sound similar at all? Isn't that amazing that the strategy of tech companies in 2024 is the same as the strategy of the king of Babylon? Like 3,000 years ago, he was doing this. Free food is not Google's invention. So this is what the king does. The king says, I'm going to take all these young people, and notice what he's teaching them. The language and literature of the Babylonians. He's training them to be Babylonian. I don't know, I live about half a mile from Google, so a lot of my reference points is Google. The same might be true of many of the companies you're at, but Google actually, as part of their, some of you may work for Google. Any Google employees here? Any? Nope. I guess maybe they don't have. Part of their review process is you get reviewed on how googly you are. That's an actual adjective. There are 4 things in their regular review process, and one of them is, how googly are you? And googly is a specific adjective that means certain things, and it's how well have you conformed to the values of our company? And by the way, many of those values are great. So it's not that we completely discard them just because they come from a tech company, but some of them are not so great. So this is what Nebuchadnezzar is doing, is he's training these young people to live in Babylon, to become Babylonian. So again, this is what Daniel and his friends experienced. They had a natural environment, quite literally Jerusalem. They were compelled to leave that, to go into Babylon. And their tension then is to wrestle with, how do I maintain this identity in the midst of this foreign environment? So as the story continues, they figure out a way to do this. Daniel 1, 8-10, Daniel resolved not to defile himself with the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself this way. Now I want to stop there for a minute and think about what Daniel is doing. I was actually just in a class this past week where we were talking about interpreting the Old Testament, and this passage came up because this word here for royal food and wine, this became kind of a joke among our pastoral staff. It's a Hebrew word called potbog. You could translate it P-A-T-B-A-G, potbog. And we spent all this time talking about potbog, and so then we would go out to eat in Vancouver and look for potbog on the menu at all these restaurants. We found a lot of poutine, but not so much potbog. Potbog is a word that means the king's food. It is the thing that kings would eat. It was royal food, it was rich, it was privileged, it was reserved. What they don't know about potbog is what exactly the food was, although it seems to be that there was nothing inherent in the food that would have violated kosher laws. Not sure about that, but at any rate, the text doesn't tell us why eating the king's food would defile Daniel. It doesn't say because it included meat, or because it included pork, or because it wasn't blessed the right way, or because it was mixed with blood. It doesn't give us anything from the Levitical law to say what was wrong with potbog. My personal take is that the narrator omits that intentionally because he doesn't want to give us a recipe to follow. He wants to paint a picture of Daniel saying, I'm on a quest to engage my environment and maintain my identity. To do that, I'm going to draw a line here. And he picks a place to draw the line. Now, the line that God might be leading you to draw might be here, it might be there, it might be somewhere else. The question is, where do you draw that line? Where do you hold back some of your identity? How do you restrain yourself from quite literally selling yourself to your employer and to the values and mission? How do you maintain that identity? And I think what's helpful to think about is two words that maybe capture that distinction. So this is the temptation that Daniel is wrestling with. And I'm going to jump forward because you probably know the rest of the story. Daniel negotiated with the manager of this young executive training program to only have vegetables. And as it turns out, at the end of the story, Daniel and his friends were healthier than everybody else. And so what Daniel has found a way to do is, I think he's found the difference between alliance and allegiance. This is from dictionary.com. Alliance is a merging of efforts or interests by persons, families, states, or organizations. Allegiance is loyalty or devotion to some person, group, cause, or the like. And what I want to suggest is that we can and should offer our alliance to our employers, but not our allegiances. That it is appropriate and it is part of how God has called us to operate. It is according to the model that Daniel sets to align our interests with the interests of our company. So if you're going to work for your company, your job is to help your company succeed. And this is one of the most remarkable things I think about the Daniel story, is that Daniel's job was to help Nebuchadnezzar succeed in being the kind of king that Nebuchadnezzar was. And we know what kind of king he was. He was not a good king. He was not a nice king. He was an effective king, but he was brutal. And we know that Daniel did well at his job. How do we know this? Because he didn't get killed. You don't get fired in Babylon, you get executed. So the fact that Daniel has many stories means that he was successful. Otherwise, his story would have ended. So Daniel found a way to serve the king of Babylon and make Nebuchadnezzar successful as a king while still maintaining his personal integrity. That's the remarkable thing. He found a way to say, I can offer my alliance to this king, but not my allegiance. And story after story in Daniel, I think, is drawing that line. I will serve the king, but I will not worship his idol. I will serve the king, but I will not stop praying to my God. I will serve the king, but I will not do this other thing. And so he's finding ways, he's finding those lines to be drawn. And I think that's the challenge for us, is to figure out what alliance looks like in contrast to allegiance. Meta is a big employer in our area, so I sometimes say if Daniel could work for Nebuchadnezzar, then you could work for Mark Zuckerberg. I think actually Mark Zuckerberg, from what I've heard, is actually a very good boss. So maybe that's unfair to Zuckerberg, because we know Nebuchadnezzar was certainly not. But if you can fill in the blank with your boss. If Daniel can work for Nebuchadnezzar, you can work for blank, and you can find a way to do this. You can somehow find a way. Now sometimes you can't. Sometimes God calls you to leave your employer, and that's absolutely what God does in cases. So sometimes you decide to break that alliance, and that's appropriate. But for most of us, if we're going to stay where we are, we do have to ally ourselves without finding that allegiance. So just a few more slides before I wrap up. Here's just another kind of pictorial diagram of this. You have Daniel in the middle, and you have these forces that he's surrounded by. So many of you might feel this way, where you have your employer, you have your employer's goals, you have God, you have the world, you have your family, and you're trying to figure out, how do I orient all of my responsibilities around all of these forces? So what Daniel was able to do is to give his alliance to Nebuchadnezzar, his service to Babylon, his allegiance to God, and his love for Israel. So he was able to ally his efforts and spend a lot of his time serving the king for the sake of Babylon. He was serving this. I mean, it's just crazy that he did this. Like, Babylon eventually becomes the metaphor for evil in the scriptures. Babylon is the evil empire. And Daniel, one of the greatest Old Testament characters, made it flourish. So it's just kind of mind-boggling to think of how he was able to do that. But at the same time, he was able to keep his allegiance to God and love his people as primary and not lose that identity. So the question for you then, I think, to think about is, what does that look like for you? What is the king that you have to ally yourself with? What is the organization you have to serve? And how do you do that at the same time that you find your allegiance to God and your love for his kingdom? So I'm often not super practical, because I'd rather give you a framework and invite you to have the Spirit work within that framework. So maybe if you're wanting some more concrete things, we can kind of unpack that as part of the Q&A, because there are some concrete things that sometimes make this helpful. But there's another verse. In terms of practical things, I'll just wrap up with this. And this is a great verse in thinking about what it looks like to be in exile. 1 Peter really draws out the exile themes in his scriptures. And he gives some very practical aspects here, which I don't have time to go all the way through. But here's, if you want to kind of reflect on some of these languages, he talks about an intellectual part of this process of knowing things. He talks about knowing that end state. The theological term is the teleological focus. The teleological is just knowing the end of the story, orienting yourself towards the end. Talks about not being conformed, talks about living with faithfulness today, and then knowing your identity, knowing what that blue circle is so that you can hold on to it.